The burning of Washington was not simply a military raid. It was a terrifying audit of a young republic's readiness, memory, and symbols. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the night. A capital can look permanent before it is strong. It can hold a Congress, a president's house, departments of state, official papers, military stores, portraits, books, laws, and ceremonies, and still be dangerously exposed. In late August 1814, the United States Capitol was not a fortress. It was a young city built to represent federal power, yet it could be reached by an enemy force moving inland from the Patuxent River. The contradiction was stark. Washington contained the visible architecture of national authority, but the defense of that authority depended on roads, rivers, militia, warning, judgment, and time. On August 24, 1814, time ran out. By nightfall, British troops would enter Washington after defeating American forces at Bladensburg, Maryland. Before the fires were set, before smoke climbed from the Capitol and the President's house, before the Treasury, War Department, and State Department buildings burned, people inside the Capitol were already measuring what could be saved. Clerks gathered records. Officials fled. Sailors prepared to deny naval supplies to the enemy. Dolley Madison insisted that Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington be removed from the president's house before she left. The crisis forced a question no republic wants to face. If the buildings of government can be reached, burned, and emptied in a single night, where does the nation's power actually reside? Washington was still a new capital. The president's house had opened only in 1800. The city was meant to embody the future of the republic, but much of that future still looked unfinished, improvised, or thinly protected. The Capitol itself was incomplete in 1814. Its north and south wings stood apart, joined by a wooden walkway where the central building was intended to rise. Inside those wings were not merely rooms. They contained the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress. In one unfinished complex stood the legislative, judicial, and intellectual heart of the federal government. That made the Capitol a target of unusual meaning. To burn it was to attack more than stone and wood. It was to strike the working machinery of the American state. The same was true of the president's house. It was a residence, but also a symbol of executive authority. The federal departments held papers, correspondence, accounts, military records, and the memory of decisions. The Library of Congress held more than 3,000 books. These were not just possessions. They were instruments of government, did and would not, and yet the city that held them was vulnerable. The geography mattered. Washington sat near waterways and roads that could become avenues of danger. The eastern branch of the Potomac River, now the Anacostia River, lay near Bladensburg. The road from Bladensburg led toward the Capitol. A force that could land in Maryland, move inland, defeat the defenders, and continue down that route could turn a regional military operation into a national humiliation. The British did not need to occupy the United States for months. They needed only to reach the symbolic center and show that it could be touched. By late August, the danger was no longer abstract. British forces had landed at Benedict, Maryland, on the Patuxent River. From there, they advanced toward Bladensburg and Washington. The names attached to that campaign would soon become central to the memory of the burning. Major General Robert Ross, Rear Admiral George Cockburn, and Sir Alexander Cochrane. Their movement inland exposed the fragile space between the Chesapeake region and the Capitol. Each mile narrowed the distance between a war fought along coasts and waterways and a fire set in the rooms of government. The American position was troubled, not only by distance, but by preparation. At Bladensburg, according to the National Park Service, the American defenders were numerically stronger than the British. That fact makes the defeat harder, not easier to explain. Numbers alone did not make a defense. Many defenders were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and arranged in lines that could not support one another. Command decisions, militia readiness, and battlefield placement all mattered. The result was that the road to Washington could be cleared in a single afternoon. But before the battle itself, the city already contained the evidence of fear. Federal records had to be moved. State Department clerks, including John Graham, Stephen Pleasanton, and Josias King, packed important records, including the Charters of Freedom, into coarse linen bags and carts. On August 24th, Those evacuated records were carried to Leesburg, Virginia, about 35 miles northwest of Washington, and locked in a cellar vault of an abandoned house. The keys were left with the local sheriff. There is something almost cinematic in that image, but its meaning is practical and severe. The founding documents and federal papers were not safe because the Capitol was safe. They were safe because individuals recognized danger and moved them out of reach. The preservation of national memory depended on clerks, bags, carts, roads, and a cellar vault far from the city. A republic that had written itself into existence now had to hide its papers from fire. Other records were not as fortunate. Congressional clerks saved some House and Senate papers, but many records of Congress and archives of the Navy, War, and Treasury departments were lost in the fires. That loss matters because archives are not passive. They are the memory by which a government accounts for itself. They hold debts, orders, claims, communications, and precedents. When records burn, the damage extends beyond the moment of flame. It reaches backward into proof and forward into administration. The same night threatened military stores as well as documents. At the Washington Navy Yard, American forces set fire to ships, ammunition, public stores, and supplies to prevent them from falling into British hands. This was an act of denial, not victory. It meant that some destruction in Washington came from American hands under pressure, because allowing the enemy to capture useful materials was judged worse than burning them first. In that sense, the Capitol's vulnerability was total. Buildings could be burned by the invader. Supplies could be burned by defenders. Papers could be rushed away. Symbols could be carried from their frames. The story of the portrait of George Washington belongs to that same pattern. Dolley Madison insisted that Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait be removed from the president's house before she fled. Paul Jennings, a 15-year-old enslaved African-American in the White House, helped in the effort. Later accounts differ on exactly how the painting was removed, but the essential fact remains. As the enemy approached, the image of the first president had to be rescued from the president's residence. The symbol of founding leadership survived not because the building was secure, but because people acted before the flames arrived. This is what makes August 24, 1814, more than a dramatic night of destruction. It was a test of what the United States had built and what it had failed to protect. The public buildings were targets, but they were also containers. Inside them were books, laws, courtrooms, correspondence, furniture, weapons, portraits, and routines. The British burning of Washington was a symbolic and punitive strike against the United States government, shaped in part by retaliation for American destruction in Upper Canada, including the burning of York, now Toronto, on April 27, 1813. But its impact in Washington came from the concentration of national meaning inside a capital that could not keep an enemy out. The irony is that Washington was designed to project permanence. Its avenues, public buildings, and federal spaces were supposed to express confidence in the Republic's future. Yet in 1814, that confidence was not matched by adequate defense. The city's power was real, but its protection was uncertain. The Capitol could house Congress and the Supreme Court, but its unfinished form still included a wooden walkway. The departments could hold archives, but clerks had to save what they could by cart. The Navy Yard could store supplies, but those supplies had to be destroyed. The president's house could host official life, but its occupants had to flee. By the evening of August 24th, the question was no longer whether the Capitol was symbolically important. Everyone understood that it was. The question was whether symbolic importance could stop an army. It could not. The road to that answer began away from the burning buildings, away from the dinner table left in the president's house, away from the Capitol chambers where fires would soon be made from furniture and accelerants. It began at the water's edge, where British power came ashore at Benedict, Maryland, on the Patuxent River. From that landing, the door to the Capitol began to open. From the water's edge, the danger took form. Benedict, Maryland, was not Washington. It was not the Capitol, not the president's house, not the place where laws were debated or treaties kept. It was a small landing point on the Patuxent River, set into the tidewater world of southern Maryland. But in late August 1814, its importance came from position. It was a door, and when British troops landed there, that door opened inland. The Patuxent mattered because it gave the British a way to turn naval power into a march. Ships could move men, guns, supplies, and command decisions up the Chesapeake system, but ships alone could not burn the public buildings of Washington. For that, soldiers had to come ashore. They had to step from boats onto Maryland ground, form columns, and begin the slow, exposed work of moving overland toward the capital. Benedict was where that transformation began. For the people of Washington, the threat did not arrive first as flame. It arrived as distance closing. A landing on the Patuxent meant that the war was no longer only on the coast, no longer only at the edge of the Chesapeake, no longer somewhere beyond the daily reach of the capital's streets and offices. The British force was now inland, moving through the same regional landscape that connected farms, roads, rivers, towns, and the federal city. The men directing that movement represented different parts of British power. Major General Robert Ross commanded the British land force. He was the officer whose soldiers would march through Maryland and, after Bladensburg, enter Washington. His role was practical and immediate: to lead troops over the roads, maintain the column, and bring the force to the point where symbolic targets could be struck. Washington could not be attacked by naval threat alone. Ross's troops were the instrument that made the raid physically possible. Beside him in the campaign stood Rear Admiral George Cockburn, one of the most forceful British naval figures connected to the attack. Cockburn had already become closely associated with operations in the Chesapeake. In the story of Washington's burning, his name appears not as a distant planner, but as a naval commander tied to the movement that brought British violence from water to shore. He understood the Chesapeake not simply as open water, but as a system of approaches. Rivers were not barriers. They were roads. Above these figures was Sir Alexander Cochrane, the strategic commander connected to the wider British campaign. Cochrane's role reminds us that the movement toward Washington was not an accident born from one afternoon's opportunity. It belonged to a broader British use of pressure along the American coast and Chesapeake. The capital was vulnerable because geography, planning, and military opportunity had met at the same moment. Ross, Cockburn, and Cochrane did not need to conquer the United States. They did not need to hold Washington. The later destruction of public buildings would show the shape of the operation clearly: a punitive and symbolic strike against the United States government, not a permanent occupation of the Capitol. But before any public building could be fired, before the Capitol's rooms could fill with smoke, before the president's house could be entered, the British first needed a route. Benedict gave them one. The Patuxent River was the beginning of a sequence. From Benedict, the movement pointed toward the interior of Maryland. From the interior, the line of danger bent toward Bladensburg. From Bladensburg, the road opened toward Washington. That is why the landing cannot be treated as a minor prelude. It was the first visible stage of a campaign that would compress geography into crisis. There is a particular unease in this kind of military movement. A fleet appears, but the capital does not yet burn. Troops land, but the battle has not yet been fought. Roads are taken, but the destination is still ahead. In that interval, uncertainty does some of the work of fear. Officials and civilians could know that the British had come ashore without knowing exactly where the blow would fall or how quickly it would arrive. Baltimore, Washington, the Navy Yard, the departments, the roads through Maryland, all could seem possible within the same field of anxiety. But the choice of Benedict began to narrow those possibilities. It placed a British force on a line from the Patuxent toward the approaches to Washington. It made the capital's vulnerability less theoretical than it had been. The young federal city, already exposed by its unfinished buildings and incomplete defenses, now had to measure the distance between itself and an army on Maryland soil. The British commanders were operating with the advantages of mobility and initiative. They chose where to land. They chose when to move. They forced American leaders to interpret their intentions while time ran against them. Every mile inland mattered, because every mile reduced the space in which the Americans could organize a defense. This was one of the quiet realities behind the drama of August 24, 1814. The burning of Washington is often remembered through its night scenes: firelight on public buildings, smoke rising from the Capitol, the president's house entered and then set alight. But the night depended on daylight decisions made before it. It depended on the British ability to come ashore at Benedict, to keep moving, and to reach the American defensive line before Washington could be made secure. The geography of the campaign also reveals the weakness of relying on symbolic geography. Washington was the capital, but its importance did not make the roads defend themselves. It held the institutions of government, but institutions needed soldiers, coordination, and time. The Patuxent landing exposed the difference between what a place represented and what a place could resist. For Ross's troops, Benedict was the beginning of a march. For Cockburn and the naval command, it was a point where ships had delivered force close enough to matter. For Cochrane's wider campaign, it was one move in a larger pressure against the American coast and government. For Washington, it was a warning that the barrier between the Chesapeake and the capital was not strong enough. From that moment, the story begins to move at the pace of roads. The British column advancing inland carried with it more than muskets and equipment. It carried the possibility that the American capital might be reached, not in some distant future, but within the unfolding crisis of late August. The route ahead led through Maryland communities and toward the crossing points and approaches that would determine whether the city could be defended. The name that would soon matter most was Bladensburg, near the eastern branch of the Potomac River, now the Anacostia River. There, the approaching threat would meet an American defense shaped by urgency, confusion, and command strain. President James Madison, Secretary of State James Monroe, and General William Winder would all become part of the effort to understand and resist the British advance. But before the disorder at Bladensburg, before the collapse that cleared the road, there was Benedict, a landing place, a river, a column beginning to move. The capital had not yet fallen. The buildings still stood. The records not yet saved were still at risk. The dinner table in the president's house had not yet become one of the enduring images of interruption. But the decisive motion had begun. The door on the Patuxent was open, and the road to Washington now ran through Maryland. From Benedict, the British column did not need to capture Maryland. It needed only to move through it. That distinction mattered. Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn were not leading an army of occupation toward a defended frontier. They were leading a hard, mobile force inland from the Patuxent River through a landscape of roads, farms, river crossings, and uncertain reports. Their object was pressure. Their advantage was momentum. Every mile they gained inland forced the American government to guess where the blow would fall. Washington was the obvious fear, but not the only possible target. The region offered choices. A movement might threaten the capital, or it might shift toward other points in the Chesapeake. The uncertainty was itself a weapon. It stretched the American response before the battle had even begun. For the Americans, the road from Benedict to Bladensburg became a corridor of confusion. Messages had to travel faster than marching men. Local militia had to gather. Federal officials had to interpret fragmentary reports. Military command had to be formed into something useful, and quickly. The British advance was not a distant rumor anymore. It was a moving fact, and it was moving toward the nerve center of the Republic. At the center of the American response stood General William Winder. Winder's challenge was not simply to be brave or to know that Washington had to be defended. His challenge was practical and unforgiving. He had to arrange a defense with limited time, uneven forces, and uncertain intelligence. The men who would be called on to resist the British were not all regular soldiers. Many were militia, and the quality of training, equipment, and preparation varied sharply. A capital can order defenses on paper, but paper does not turn scattered forces into a steady line under fire. The political leaders could not remain untouched by the emergency. President James Madison was not only the head of government, he was a visible symbol of whether the government could continue to function under threat. Secretary of State James Monroe was drawn directly into the effort to understand the British movement and strengthen the defense. Their presence showed the seriousness of the crisis, but it also revealed the strain between civil authority and military command. In a moment of danger, everyone wanted action. Not everyone could provide clarity. This was one of the most fragile parts of the American situation. Washington was the capital, but it was not a fortress. It contained the Capitol, the President's House, the War Department, the State Department, the Treasury, the Library of Congress, and the records of national government. Yet the protection of those places depended on troops being gathered and placed outside the city, along the routes by which the British might approach. The defense of national symbols had to happen on Maryland roads and at a crossing near Bladensburg. Bladensburg lay near the eastern branch of the Potomac River, known today as the Anacostia River. Its importance was geographic before it became historical. A force coming from the east or northeast toward Washington had to reckon with that place and its approaches. The town and its crossing formed part of the last defensive space between the British landing force and the capital itself. If an American line held there, Washington might be spared. If it failed, the road would open. By late August, that was the shape of the crisis. The British had come ashore at Benedict. They had moved inland from the Patuxent. Washington was watching the danger approach, but not from behind walls. The capital's fate was being pushed outward into a defensive position that had to be assembled under pressure. Madison, Monroe, and Winder occupied different roles in this anxious machinery. Madison carried the burden of the presidency at a moment when the government's physical seat was in danger. Monroe, as Secretary of State, was part of the administration's immediate response, engaged in the effort to assess and resist the advance. Winder bore the military responsibility for organizing the defense that would stand between the British and the city. Together, they represented a government trying to act while events were moving faster than its arrangements. That problem was not unique to Washington, but in Washington, it was exposed with unusual cruelty. The city's vulnerability had been visible for years in its unfinished buildings, broad spaces, and dependence on surrounding roads and waterways. Now, those vulnerabilities were no longer architectural or administrative details. They were operational facts. The enemy did not need to destroy the American army in a grand campaign. It needed to break through one improvised shield. The anxiety in the city must be understood through that lens. The public buildings still stood. The records were still in their offices. The president's house still held the routines of government life. But the distance between ordinary order and military emergency was narrowing hour by hour. Officials had to consider not only how to fight, but what might have to be saved if fighting failed. The preservation of documents, portraits, and institutional memory would soon become its own desperate campaign. Before that could happen, the armed line had to be tested. The British approach also forced a question that every young government fears: who is truly in control when the emergency arrives? In calm times, authority can appear settled. The president presides. Secretaries administer departments. Generals command troops. Congress occupies chambers. Records rest in offices. But war disturbs the neatness of those roles. A general needs time and obedience. A president needs information. Cabinet officers become messengers, observers, advisors, and participants in decisions that cannot wait. Militia units arrive with uneven readiness. Roads become more important than proclamations. Geography begins to dictate politics. Bladensburg became the point where these tensions converged. The American defensive effort was not meaningless. Men did gather. Positions were taken. Leaders understood that Washington could not simply be abandoned without a fight. But a defensive line is more than a collection of men with weapons. It depends on placement, support, training, confidence, and command. If one part gives way and another cannot reinforce it, the line becomes a series of isolated hopes. If troops are poorly trained or poorly equipped, numbers alone can mislead. If commanders and civilian leaders operate under urgent uncertainty, hesitation and overcorrection can both become dangerous. This was the atmosphere on the road to Bladensburg, not yet battle, but already crisis. The British column was moving toward a place that would decide the capital's immediate future. The American response was taking shape, but not with the calm confidence of a prepared fortress. It was a defense formed in motion, under the gaze of national leaders, with the city's public buildings and archives behind it. The stakes were not abstract. If the line near Bladensburg failed, the way into Washington would be cleared before nightfall. And so, before the fires, before the march down Pennsylvania Avenue, before the Capitol's chambers were turned into furnaces of furniture and accelerant, there was this suspended moment on the Maryland road. The enemy was close enough to be real. The Capitol was close enough to be vulnerable. The American leadership knew the danger, but knowing was not the same as stopping it. At Bladensburg, the line would have to hold. At Bladensburg, the line did not hold. The sentence is simple, almost too simple for what it meant. A battlefield in Maryland became the hinge between an anxious capital and a burning one. The British column that had come inland from Benedict was no longer a distant threat moving through uncertain roads. On August 24, 1814, it reached the place where American defenders had gathered to block the way to Washington. Bladensburg stood near the eastern branch of the Potomac River, the waterway now known as the Anacostia River. Its location gave it importance beyond its size. Roads from the northeast approached the capital through this area, and the British advance made the town and its crossings a natural point of decision. If the Americans could stop Major General Robert Ross there, Washington might have time. If they could not, the road into the city would open in a single afternoon. The battle lasted about 3 hours. That short span is part of the shock of Bladensburg. The destruction in Washington that night would become the remembered image. The Capitol, the President's house, the public departments, the flames against the dark. But the possibility of that night was created earlier, in daylight, on a battlefield where the American defense came apart faster than the stakes seemed to allow. According to the National Park Service, the American defenders at Bladensburg were numerically stronger than the British force they faced. On paper, that mattered. Numbers have a way of suggesting strength, and in a national emergency, they can offer the comfort of arithmetic. More men should mean a stronger line. More defenders should mean more resistance. But war rarely obeys paper strength alone. Many of the American defenders were poorly trained. Many were poorly equipped. They were placed in defensive lines that could not support one another. These facts are not small technical details. They are the structure of the failure. A battlefield line is not only a row of men facing an enemy. It is a system of trust, discipline, communication, and mutual support. If one part bends, another must be able to reinforce it. If a forward position gives way, the next line must be close enough, organized enough, and confident enough to absorb the shock. At Bladensburg, the American positions did not form that kind of system. The defenders were arranged in separated lines, and those lines lacked the cohesion needed for the pressure that was coming. The result was a defense that could look substantial in pieces, but fragile as a whole. Men could be present without being effectively connected. Guns could be placed without creating a durable barrier. Commanders could understand the danger without being able to make the field respond as one. This is where the story of Bladensburg becomes more than a simple tale of panic. It reveals a government trying to defend its capital without the structure of preparation that such a defense required. Washington held national symbols, federal offices, military supplies, and records that embodied the work of the Republic. But the line outside the city depended heavily on men who were not uniformly trained for the kind of battle they now had to fight. General William Winder carried the burden of command in that moment. Around him, national leaders had already been drawn toward the crisis. President James Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe were not distant figures in a sealed capital, removed from the battlefield by ceremony. They were part of a government watching the danger arrive almost in real time. Yet presence did not solve the problem of military organization. Seeing the threat did not create training. Knowing the road to Washington was at stake did not make the defensive lines mutually supporting. The British, by contrast, had momentum. They had come from the Patuxent River with purpose, led by commanders who understood the value of speed. Major General Robert Ross commanded the ground force. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, whose name had already become closely tied to the Chesapeake campaign, accompanied the movement inland. Their aim was not to pause before the capital and invite delay. It was to break through the barrier between the landing and Washington. At Bladensburg, that barrier proved weaker than its numbers suggested. As the battle unfolded, the defects in the American arrangement became visible. The first lines could not count on the kind of support that might have steadied them. Poor training and poor equipment compounded the problem. In combat, uncertainty spreads quickly. A line that is unsure of itself does not merely lose ground, it can transmit fear backward. When men begin to withdraw, others who cannot see the whole field may only see movement, smoke, confusion, and the suggestion that the position has already failed. The battle's short duration shows how quickly a defensive plan can unravel when its parts are not integrated. About 3 hours were enough to turn the last approach to Washington from a defended route into an open road. The capital did not fall because of a long siege. It did not fall after walls were battered down or supplies exhausted. It became vulnerable because the army in front of it could not stop the British advance at the decisive crossing. That is what makes Bladensburg so stark. It was not merely a lost battle. It was a failure of connection. The American defenders were stronger in number, but those numbers were scattered across arrangements that did not reinforce each other effectively. The government behind them was symbolically powerful, but symbols could not steady an unsupported line. The city behind them was the seat of national authority, but authority could not substitute for discipline in the field. For Washington, the consequences were immediate. Once the British won at Bladensburg, the route into the capital was cleared. There would be no long interval for recovery. There would be no deep defensive belt between the battlefield and the public buildings. The same date that saw the American line collapse would see British troops enter Washington around 8 o'clock that evening. The distance between battle and burning was measured in hours. It is important to pause over that compression of time. On the morning and afternoon of August 24th, Washington was threatened. By evening, it would be entered by an enemy force. Before night was over, the Capitol and other public buildings would be targets of fire. The transformation from fear to reality happened with a speed that gave the event its lasting force. Bladensburg made that speed possible. The American collapse there would later be remembered with embarrassment, and not without reason. The capital of the United States had been left exposed by a defense that could not withstand the pressure placed upon it. But embarrassment can flatten history if it becomes the only lens. The men at Bladensburg were not all cowards, and the field was not empty of courage. Some positions failed quickly. Others held longer. The disorder was real, but it did not erase every act of resistance. This distinction matters because the battle was both a rout and a place of stubborn fighting. The overall line could not hold, yet within that collapse, certain groups stood out. The most notable resistance came from the 3rd American Defensive Line, where Commodore Joshua Barney and his men would make a stand that complicated the memory of the day. Barney had been connected to the naval defense of the Chesapeake, and at Bladensburg, his force included about 400 flotillamen, 114 United States Marines, and militiamen. Their position would not save the battlefield. It would not close the road to Washington. But for a time, amid a defense that was breaking apart, they showed what organized resistance could look like. That is why Bladensburg must be understood in layers. At the largest scale, it was the American defeat that opened the capital. At the level of command and arrangement, it exposed the danger of relying on poorly trained and poorly equipped defenders placed in lines that could not support one another. At the human level, it held moments of fear, confusion, endurance, and resolve. The road to Washington was cleared because the line failed. But before the British column moved on toward the city, before the evening march along the route that would lead toward the capital, there remained one hard point of resistance on the field. In the midst of collapse, Barney's guns and men held long enough to leave a different kind of memory, not victory, but defiance inside defeat. At Bladensburg, defeat came in motion. Lines gave way, men fell back, officers tried to steady formations that were already dissolving, and the road behind the battlefield began to matter as much as the ground in front of it. But collapse was not the only thing happening there. On the 3rd American Defensive Line, Commodore Joshua Barney and the men around him created a hard center of resistance, a place where the British advance meant discipline, artillery, and close, stubborn fire. Barney's stand does not change the result of the battle. It does not rescue Washington. It does not turn August 24th, 1814, into anything other than a day of grave American failure. But it changes how the battlefield should be remembered. The Battle of Bladensburg was not simply a scene of panic. It was also a scene in which some men, placed in the same failing defense as everyone else, held long enough to show that courage and disorder could exist at the same time. Joshua Barney was not an anonymous figure on that field. He was a commodore, and the men most closely associated with his position came from a naval world, suddenly forced to fight on land. Around him were about 400 flotillamen, sailors connected to the Chesapeake defense, joined by 114 United States Marines and militiamen. Their position formed part of the 3rd American Defensive Line, the last meaningful barrier before the route toward Washington opened completely. The composition of that force matters. These were not simply militia drawn into a hurried line and left to wait. Barney's flotillamen had a different kind of experience from many of the defenders at Bladensburg. They were accustomed to command, to guns, to the rhythms of service, even if the battlefield itself was not the deck of a vessel or the confined space of river fighting. The United States Marines, with them, added another element of steadiness. In a battle remembered for formations that could not support one another, Barney's command stood out because it could still act as an organized body. That contrast was visible because the rest of the defensive system had already begun to fail. The American army at Bladensburg had been placed in separate lines, and those lines were not mutually supporting in the way they needed to be. When forward positions broke, their failure did not produce a controlled withdrawal into a deeper, stronger line. It produced confusion. Men who had been expected to resist the British advance found themselves exposed, uncertain, or watching others retreat. The weakness was not only individual fear, it was structural. A defense arranged without sufficient cohesion can make courage harder to use. Barney's position became significant because it resisted that pattern for a time. His guns and men delivered a level of opposition that the British could not simply dismiss as another broken line. In the middle of a battle that lasted about 3 hours and steadily opened the way to Washington, this third-line stand imposed a pause, a cost, and a memory. It forced the advancing force to deal with Americans who were not running, not scattering, not surrendering the ground in the first shock of contact. The scene is important because it complicates the phrase often attached to Bladensburg. A rout is a word of movement. It suggests speed, disorder, and humiliation. It is not wrong for the larger outcome. The American defeat at Bladensburg cleared the road to the capital, and by that evening, British troops would enter Washington. But if the word rout is allowed to flatten everything, it erases the men who fought hard inside the collapsing frame. Barney's stand is the reminder that defeat can contain bravery without ceasing to be defeat. On that third line, the American resistance had a different texture. The flotillamen and Marines were not saving a battle already slipping away. They were creating a local order within a wider disorder. The guns gave them force. The discipline gave them shape. Barney's leadership gave them a center. Around them, the consequences of earlier failures were arriving in real time. The British had crossed from approach to attack, from attack to pressure, from pressure to breakthrough. Every position that fell made Barney's line more isolated. That isolation was fatal to the stand, even if it did not make the stand meaningless. A force can fight well and still be placed in a position that cannot be sustained. The third line could not undo the collapse of the first and second. It could not repair the gaps in command, training, equipment, and placement that had marked the American defense. It could not create support where support had failed to appear. What it could do, and what it did, was resist until the enemy found the means to move around it. The British outflanked Barney's position. That word, outflanked, is quiet, almost technical, but on a battlefield it can be devastating. It means the front is no longer the only danger. It means the force holding firm against one direction is suddenly threatened from another. It means bravery becomes vulnerable to geometry. Barney's men had made a stand, but once the position was turned, continued resistance became increasingly difficult and increasingly costly. Then Barney was wounded. The wound matters not because it transforms him into legend by itself, but because it marks the moment when the center of that resistance was physically broken. A commander on a field like Bladensburg was not merely a name in a report. He was direction, authority, and confidence. Around Barney, the flotillamen, Marines, and militiamen had held together when other parts of the American defense had unraveled. When he was wounded and the position had been outflanked, the stand reached its limit. There is a temptation in telling military history to divide battles into clean categories: competent or incompetent, brave or cowardly, heroic or shameful. Bladensburg resists that simplicity. It was, in strategic consequence, a disastrous American defeat. It exposed the capital. It allowed Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn to continue the march that would bring British troops into Washington around 8 o'clock that night. It stands as the battlefield failure that made the burning of public buildings possible. And yet within that failure, Barney's men fought with distinction. That does not excuse the larger collapse. It gives the collapse a human scale. It reminds us that institutions fail through decisions, arrangements, expectations, and unreadiness, while individuals inside those institutions may still behave with resolve. The American defensive plan at Bladensburg could break apart even as one portion of it fought well. The two truths are not in conflict. They belong to the same afternoon. This is why Barney's stand has endured in the memory of the battle. It offers no easy consolation. The road to Washington still opened. The capital still lay ahead, vulnerable and exposed. The Capitol, the President's House, the Treasury, the War Department, and the State Department were still in the path of a force that had now defeated the defenders meant to stop it. But on the field itself, before the march resumed, there had been a demonstration of what organized resistance could look like when command, training, and determination came together. The stand also sharpens the tragedy of the day. If courage existed on the field, then the defeat cannot be explained only by an absence of courage. If some men fought well, then the larger problem was deeper. It lay in the way the defense had been prepared, placed, and commanded. It lay in the mismatch between the importance of Washington and the fragility of the force assembled to protect it. It lay in the uneasy reality that a young republic had placed its national symbols within reach of an enemy column and then failed to build a defense equal to the stakes. By the time Barney's resistance was overcome, the meaning of the day had shifted. The battle was no longer only about Bladensburg. It was about what lay beyond it. The British did not need to hold the field for weeks or occupy Maryland as a conquered province. They needed to clear the route, keep moving, and strike the public face of the United States government. Bladensburg had given them that opening. Behind the American lines, the consequences were already moving faster than any formal announcement could. Washington was not a distant abstraction. It was close enough for fear to become action. While soldiers and commanders faced the collapse at Bladensburg, clerks in the capital were confronting a different emergency. If the army could not guarantee the city's safety, then papers, records, and symbols had to be saved by other means. The courage at Barney's line and the urgency in Washington belonged to the same day. One was measured in artillery, musketry, wounds, and flanking movement. The other would be measured in coarse linen bags, carts, hurried choices, and documents carried away from danger. As the last hard point of resistance at Bladensburg was outflanked, another kind of defense was already underway, not of ground but of memory, law, and the written record of the Republic. While Barney's guns were still part of the soundscape east of Washington, another struggle was unfolding in rooms where the weapons were not cannon but keys, boxes, bags, and hands. The danger to the capital was no longer theoretical. The road from Bladensburg was becoming an open route. If the city could not be defended in the field, then some part of the government had to survive by being carried away. This was not a dramatic rescue in the usual military sense. There were no polished formations, no banners, no final charge. It was the work of clerks. The State Department held records that were not merely administrative conveniences. They were the written memory of the federal government. Treaties, correspondence, official papers, and among the most precious national documents, the Charters of Freedom. In the young republic, the archive was not a quiet afterthought. It was proof of authority. It was evidence that the government had acted, negotiated, promised, declared, and bound itself in law. The people who moved those records were not commanding armies. They were public servants whose names rarely stand beside the generals and admirals of the War of 1812. John Graham, Stephen Pleasanton, and Josias King were among the State Department clerks involved in the effort. Their emergency was plain and physical. The papers had to be gathered. They had to be packed. They had to be moved before the British arrived. The materials of the rescue matter because they stripped the scene down to its reality. The records were packed into coarse linen bags and loaded onto carts. That image belongs beside the burning buildings that would come later. Before the flames, there was cloth, paper, weight, dust, and haste. The federal record did not leave Washington in ceremony. It left in bags. The contrast is striking. On one side of the day, the British column under Major General Robert Ross and the naval leadership connected to the campaign was breaking through the final American resistance after the battle at Bladensburg. On the other side, in the capital, clerks were deciding what could be saved from a government whose public buildings were now exposed. They could not rescue everything. No one could. Time, transport, and confusion set limits. But the most important records had to be treated as something close to irreplaceable. Washington in August 1814 was not only a seat of government, it was a concentration of fragile things. The Capitol held Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress. Department buildings held the working papers of the executive government. The President's House held the symbolic center of national authority. But archives are vulnerable in a particular way. Stone can crack and still remain. A wall can be blackened and later repaired. Paper, once burned, disappears into absence. The loss is not only material. It breaks lines of memory. That is why the movement of the records out of the city belongs inside the story of the night Washington burned. The British attack would become famous for flames. The Capitol, the President's House, the Treasury, the War Department, the State Department. But before the State Department building burned, some of what it held had already been taken beyond the immediate reach of the invading force. The preservation of those records was an act of anticipation. It depended on believing that the city might fall before it actually did. There is a particular kind of courage in that. It is quieter than battlefield courage and easier to overlook. A clerk who loads documents onto a cart is not making a stand in the way a gun crew makes a stand. But the choice still rests on danger. Someone must judge what matters. Someone must act before orders become impossible, before streets clog with flight, before smoke and darkness remove the chance to choose. The evacuation also reveals something about the structure of the early federal government. The United States was still a young republic. Its institutions had not yet acquired the weight of age. The capital itself was young and unfinished in many respects, still vulnerable in the landscape between rivers, roads, and open approaches. The government's legitimacy depended not only on buildings and officials, but on records. Documents gave continuity to a nation that had already been tested by war and political conflict. They connected the present administration to the founding generation and to the legal framework that made the republic intelligible to itself. On August 24, 1814, those documents moved away from Washington toward Leesburg, Virginia, about 35 miles northwest of the capital. The destination was not a grand federal depository. It was a place of emergency concealment. The evacuated records were locked in a cellar vault of an abandoned house. The keys were left with the local sheriff. That detail has a stillness to it. After the motion of packing and carting, after the urgency of leaving the city, the records came to rest underground in a cellar vault, away from the route of the British advance. An abandoned house in Leesburg became, for a moment, a refuge for the written core of the government. The setting was humble, almost improvised, but the meaning was immense. What could not be defended in Washington was hidden in Virginia. This was not the only effort to remove papers from danger. Congressional clerks saved some House and Senate papers. House papers were moved to a secret rural location 9 miles outside Washington. Senate papers were moved toward Prince George's County and Brookville, Maryland. These movements show a wider pattern of alarm across the federal government. The city's vulnerability was being understood office by office, file by file. And yet the rescue was incomplete. Many records of Congress and archives of the Navy, War, and Treasury departments were lost in the fires. That fact gives the saved records their sharper edge. Preservation did not mean full success. It meant survival amid loss. The night Washington burned would leave gaps, and those gaps mattered. Some portions of the government's working memory were destroyed, along with the buildings that housed them. The State Department clerks could not prevent the British from reaching the capital. They could not stop the public buildings from being set ablaze. They could not reverse the failure at Bladensburg. But they could reduce the damage to the documentary life of the Republic. In a day defined by broken defenses, their work created a narrow line of continuity. The charters of freedom being carried away in coarse linen bags is one of the most powerful images of that continuity. The phrase itself can sound monumental, as if such documents naturally belong behind glass, under guard, surrounded by marble and reverence. But on that day, their survival depended on practical labor. They had to be lifted, folded, or bundled as needed for movement, guarded from weather and confusion, and sent away from a city that could no longer promise safety. The scene also complicates the meaning of Washington's destruction. The British would burn buildings that represented the United States government. The Capitol, the President's House, and the executive departments were visible targets. But the government was not only the architecture, it was also the record, the paper trail of sovereignty. By saving key documents, the clerks helped ensure that the symbolic blow would not become a deeper erasure. There is no need to exaggerate their foresight to understand its importance. They were responding to immediate danger. The enemy was approaching. The capital was in panic. But history often turns on such responses, on the practical decisions made before the dramatic moment becomes inevitable. The preservation of archives rarely looks cinematic while it is happening. It becomes cinematic afterward, when we understand what the bags contained and what the fire could have taken. By the time British troops entered Washington around 8 o'clock that evening, some of the nation's essential records were no longer there. They were miles away, locked in a cellar vault in Leesburg, under the care of people far from the burning streets. The city could be struck. Its public buildings could be ruined. Its inhabitants could flee. But a portion of its memory had already escaped. Still, not everything that mattered could be packed into carts and sent northwest. Some symbols remained inside the city until the last possible hours. At the president's house, another act of preservation would depend not on clerks in department offices, but on a woman refusing to leave a national image behind, and on the people around her working under pressure as the enemy drew near. The archives had left Washington. Other forms of memory were still waiting to be saved. The records that left Washington in coarse linen bags carried one kind of national memory. At the president's house, another kind remained on the wall. It was not a treaty, not a law, not a cabinet paper. It was an image. Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. In a city built to house the government of a young republic, the painting was more than decoration. It represented the first president, the commander of the Continental Army, and the peaceful transfer of authority that had helped define the United States as something more durable than a wartime alliance. If the British entered the president's house and found it there, the loss would be symbolic as well as material. By August 24, 1814, the pressure on the city had become immediate. The defeat at Bladensburg had opened the road. The American line had failed. The movement of records toward Leesburg had already shown that officials understood what was at risk. But the president's house was not an archive building. It was a residence, a workplace, and a stage for national authority. Its objects carried meanings that could not be measured only by inventory. Dolley Madison was still there as danger closed in. The scene has been told many times, often with the clarity and drama of legend, the First Lady refusing to leave until Washington's portrait was saved. At the center of that story is a decision that the sources allow us to state firmly. Dolley Madison insisted that Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington be removed before she fled the president's house. She did not treat it as an expendable object. She understood that in the coming hours, the mansion might be entered, searched, burned, or stripped, and that the portrait of Washington must not be left as a trophy or reduced to ash. That insistence matters because it reveals how the defense of Washington had shifted. Earlier in the day, defense had meant roads, bridges, artillery, militia lines, and the fragile command structure around Bladensburg. In the department offices, it had meant bags, carts, keys, and clerks saving the written record. Now, inside the president's house, defense meant choosing which symbols could be carried out before time ran out. It also reminds us that the preservation of the Republic's memory was not carried out only by famous office holders. Among those who helped in the effort to save Washington's portrait was Paul Jennings, a 15-year-old enslaved African American in the White House. His presence is essential to the history because the president's house in 1814 was not only a public symbol of executive power, it was also a household sustained by enslaved labor. The image of national liberty hanging on the wall and the labor of an enslaved teenager helping to save it belonged to the same room, the same emergency, and the same historical truth. Jennings later became one of the important witnesses to this moment. His role places him inside an event often simplified into a single heroic gesture. Dolley Madison's insistence was real and consequential. But the work of removing the portrait was physical, urgent, and shared. It required hands, tools, judgment, and speed. The painting was large. It was a full-length portrait, not a small canvas that could be tucked under an arm. It had to be taken from its place in a house that was rapidly becoming unsafe. Here the story becomes more delicate, because later accounts differ on exactly how the painting was removed. Some versions emphasize the cutting of the canvas from its frame. Others describe the frame being taken apart or broken so that the portrait could be carried away. The broad fact is secure. Dolley Madison would not leave until the portrait was being saved, and Paul Jennings helped in that effort. But the precise mechanics are less certain than the power of the memory that grew around them. That uncertainty does not weaken the story. It strengthens our responsibility to tell it carefully. History often gives us events in layers. At the core are the facts that can be held with confidence. Around them are recollections, retellings, and later interpretations, shaped by memory and by the needs of each generation. The burning of Washington became one of those events Americans returned to again and again, searching for moments of courage in a day of humiliation. The rescue of Washington's portrait offered exactly that, a scene in which a national symbol was not abandoned. But if we listen closely, the scene is not simple triumph. It is an evacuation. The president's house was being emptied under threat. The First Lady was preparing to flee. The city's defenses had failed. The government was scattering. The British column was advancing from Bladensburg toward Washington. In that pressure, the portrait became a test of what could still be protected when buildings could not be held. There is something quietly cinematic in the contrast. Outside, the aftermath of battle was moving westward. Roads carried rumors, exhausted soldiers, officials, and civilians trying to understand whether the capital would be defended or deserted. Inside the president's house, attention narrowed to a wall, a frame, a painted figure. George Washington, represented at full length by Gilbert Stuart, had presided visually over the executive mansion. Now the image had to be lowered, freed, and carried away before enemy soldiers arrived. The act did not stop the burning that was coming. It did not save the president's house itself. It did not reverse Bladensburg, or restore command, or prevent the capital from becoming a target. But preservation is not always victory in the ordinary sense. Sometimes it is the refusal to let everything be taken at once. The portrait survived. After the attack and after repairs to the executive mansion, it returned. Its survival carried the memory of that day forward, not as an abstract story, but as an object still connected to the rooms through which the crisis passed. The saved Washington portrait is the only item currently on display that was present when the White House opened in 1800. That fact gives it an unusual weight. It is not simply an image of the first president. It is a survivor of the night the president's house burned. Objects like that can become witnesses. They do not speak, but their continued presence forces questions. Who saved this? Under what pressure? What was lost around it? What did its survival mean to people who returned to a blackened mansion and a damaged capital? The portrait's rescue tells us that even as public buildings were vulnerable, the symbols inside them were being judged, prioritized, and protected by people acting in the final available moments. Dolley Madison's place in this episode has endured because her decision was clear. She recognized the portrait as something the nation could not afford to leave behind. Yet, a grounded account must hold the full human scene, her insistence, the labor of those around her, the help of Paul Jennings, and the uncertainty in later accounts about the exact method of removal. The story is powerful enough without pretending that every detail is settled. By the time Dolley Madison fled, the president's house had lost the illusion of safety. The Capitol's symbols were no longer secure because they stood in official rooms. They were secure only if someone could move them beyond reach. In Leesburg, records had been locked in a cellar vault. From the president's house, Washington's portrait was carried away from the path of fire. Behind those acts was the same recognition. The British were not approaching an ordinary town. They were approaching the visible machinery of the United States government. Its papers, buildings, portraits, libraries, offices, and chambers were all part of the target because all of them helped make the Republic visible to itself and to the world. As evening came on, the city waited in a state between flight and occupation. Some things had already escaped. Others remained exposed. Roads from the northeast carried the force that had won at Bladensburg. The public buildings stood ahead in the darkening capital. Around 8 o'clock, British troops would enter Washington, and the crisis that had been approaching all day would become a night of fire. By the time the portrait of Washington was being carried away, and the records of the State Department were beyond the city, the shape of the evening had already changed. Washington was no longer waiting to learn whether the British would come. It was waiting for the moment they would arrive. That moment came around 8 o'clock on the evening of August 24th, 1814. The British force that entered the capital had spent the day fighting its way to this point. Earlier, at Bladensburg, Maryland, near the eastern branch of the Potomac River, now the Anacostia River, American lines had failed after roughly 3 hours of battle. What had been a defensive position between the enemy and the city became an open road. The defeat did not merely end a battle. It removed the last serious barrier on the approach to Washington. Now, as darkness gathered, British troops moved from the direction of Bladensburg Road toward the federal city. The route mattered. It was not an abstract invasion of a capital. It was a physical march across known ground, from the northeast, from the battlefield, toward the public buildings that gave Washington its meaning. The British had landed days earlier at Benedict, Maryland, on the Patuxent River. They had advanced inland through Maryland under Major General Robert Ross, with naval leadership tied to Rear Admiral George Cockburn and the broader campaign direction of Sir Alexander Cochrane. The movement had been uncertain while it unfolded. American leaders had tried to judge whether the objective was Baltimore, Washington, or some other point. But by this hour, uncertainty had given way to fact. The enemy was in Washington. For the people who remained in the city, the arrival must have carried a strange silence beneath the fear. Capitals are usually imagined as places of order, records in offices, soldiers in formation, legislators in chambers, carriages on planned avenues, public buildings standing as proof that a government can organize space and time. But on this night, that order had broken open. Officials had fled or scattered. Papers had been packed and rushed away. The president's house had been abandoned. The army that might have stopped the British at Bladensburg had not held. Washington was young, unfinished, and exposed. Its broad avenues and separated public buildings gave the city a symbolic grandeur, but they did not make it a fortress. The public architecture of the Republic stood in the path of an enemy force that was not trying to occupy the capital permanently, but to punish and shock the government housed there. The British attack on Washington would be directed largely at public buildings, and it was tied in part to retaliation for American destruction in Upper Canada, including the burning of York, now Toronto, on April 27, 1813. That distinction matters. The force entering Washington was not beginning a long siege or establishing a new administration. It was carrying out a raid against visible instruments of the United States government. The city's power lay in buildings, chambers, records, libraries, offices, and symbols. Those were the things that made the Republic legible. Those were the things that could burn. As the British approached the capital, the darkness turned the city into a series of shapes and absences. There were roads without the usual movement of government. There were houses with people gone or hiding. There were public buildings standing ahead, vulnerable in a way that would have seemed almost unthinkable only a short time before. The Capitol, the President's house, the Treasury, the War Department, and the State Department were not simply structures. They were the physical map of federal authority. The entry of British troops around 8 o'clock was therefore more than a military milestone. It marked the only time in American history that a foreign nation captured and burned the United States Capitol. That fact can become familiar through repetition, but it should not become ordinary. It has no parallel in the later history of the country. Washington would know fear again. It would know war again, and crisis and division. But this night remains singular. A foreign force in the capital, public buildings selected for fire, the seat of the national government briefly in enemy hands. The British came first toward the capital. From the northeast approach, it was the natural and symbolic target. The building stood on high ground, still unfinished, intended to embody the legislative power of the Republic. It had not yet become the completed dome and central structure known later. In 1814, it consisted of a north wing and a south wing, with a wooden walkway where the central building was intended to rise. But even unfinished, it held immense institutional weight. It housed the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress. The British entry into the city brought all of those institutions within reach. To stand in Washington that evening was to see how quickly a capital could be reduced to its essentials. A government can speak in laws, treaties, and proclamations, but it also depends on rooms, shelves, clerks, doors, desks, and stored paper. It depends on places where officials meet and where records are kept. The British did not need to conquer the entire nation to strike at those things. They only needed to reach this city at night, after one road had been opened by a battle outside it. The march from Bladensburg Road toward the capital compressed the whole failure of the day into a few miles. At dawn, Washington had still been threatened. By afternoon, the battlefield had broken. By evening, the capital was entered. That sequence gave the night its terrible speed. There had been warning, but not enough defense. There had been preparations, but not enough time to save everything. The archives taken to Leesburg and the portrait removed from the president's house were exceptions won by urgency. Many other things remained where they had always been, because governments are not built to disappear in a single afternoon. Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn have remained closely associated with the burning that followed. Ross commanded the land force that entered Washington. Cockburn, already known to Americans from operations along the Chesapeake, was one of the most forceful naval figures of the campaign. Their arrival in the capital gave British retaliation a stage. The public buildings of Washington would become the medium through which the message was delivered. Yet the night was not simply theater. It was material destruction. Wood, paper, furniture, books, records, and combustible contents would determine what could be burned quickly. Stone and brick would determine what remained as a shell. The meaning of the raid depended on both. A building could survive as walls and still be devastated as an institution. A chamber could be gutted even if parts of its structure endured. A library could vanish completely while its room remained identifiable as a place. For the moment, as the British entered, all of that was still imminent. The city had crossed the threshold from fear into occupation, but the fires that would define the night were just beginning to gather their targets. The capital stood ahead, unfinished and exposed, with its wings, chambers, and collections inside. What the British found there would not be merely an enemy building. It would be the working interior of a government, the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress under one vulnerable roofline. The march into Washington had ended. The burning of the Capitol was about to begin at the place where the Republic had built its public voice. The march had ended at the edge of a building that was still becoming what it was meant to be. In the dark of August 24th, 1814, the Capitol was not yet the completed dome-crowned image that later generations would know. It was a construction project as much as a national monument, a place of ambition interrupted by war. That unfinished state matters. The British troops who reached it that night were not entering a settled, massive, fully unified structure. They were approaching two principal wings, north and south, with the central building still absent. Between those wings ran a wooden walkway, standing where the middle portion of the Capitol was intended to rise. The architecture itself revealed the youth of the Republic. The government had chosen a grand site and a grand design, but the work was incomplete. The building was already important enough to embody national authority, yet still vulnerable enough to show how new that authority was. The North Wing and the South Wing were more than stone shells. Inside them, the operations of the federal government had gathered under one roofline. The Capitol housed the House of Representatives. It housed the Senate. It housed the Supreme Court. It housed the Library of Congress. In a city that was still small, unfinished, and exposed, this one building concentrated the working voice, legal mind, and recorded knowledge of the United States government. That made the Capitol different from an ordinary military target. It was not a fort. It was not a magazine on the edge of a battlefield. It was not a shipyard full of vessels and stores. Its power came from what happened inside: debate, legislation, judgment, record-keeping, reading, reference, and ceremony. The rooms gave physical form to institutions that otherwise existed in paper, precedent, and practice. The House and Senate gave Congress its chambers. The Supreme Court gave the judiciary a place inside the same national structure. The Library of Congress gave lawmakers access to a working collection of books at the heart of government. To damage the Capitol was therefore to strike at more than walls. It was to enter the place where the Republic argued with itself, wrote its laws, interpreted its Constitution, and preserved knowledge for its own use. The incompleteness of the building sharpened the symbolism. The north and south wings were standing, but they were not yet joined by the permanent central structure that had been planned. Where later stone and architectural mass would bind the Capitol together, a wooden passage connected the two halves. That walkway was practical, temporary, and fragile. It spoke quietly of a government still under construction, not only in masonry, but in habit. Washington itself carried the same contradiction. The capital had been selected and laid out as a national seat, but by 1814 it remained young and exposed. The capital, in particular, stood as a promise before it stood as a finished monument. Its design pointed toward permanence. Its actual condition revealed dependence on time, labor, funding, and peace. War arrived before that promise had hardened into completion. For those moving through the city that night, the building's unfinished form would have been visible in silhouette and approach. The two wings were separated by the gap where the central body was meant to be. The wooden connection between them made the structure feel less like one impenetrable national edifice and more like a set of vulnerable parts. Yet each part contained something essential. The south wing held the hall of the House of Representatives, the chamber that would later be known as National Statuary Hall. It was not simply a room with desks and seats. It was the place where the larger and more directly representative chamber of Congress met. It was a space built for speech, decision, and public lawmaking. Its design included architectural ambition, stone, columns, skylights, and ornament, all meant to give the work of representatives a setting worthy of national purpose. The north wing contained other central functions. The Senate met in the Capitol. The Supreme Court also had its chamber there. In the arrangement of the early Capitol, the separation of powers did not yet mean separation into distant buildings. The branches of government were physically close, sharing the same vulnerable structure. That closeness made administrative sense in a young federal city. It also meant that one attack could disturb several institutions at once. The Library of Congress was housed there as well. Its collection was still modest compared with what it would later become, but it was already central to the work of Congress. More than 3,000 books were inside the Capitol at the time of the attack. They were tools of government, not merely possessions. They supplied reference, history, law, political thought, and practical knowledge. In a republic that depended on written constitutions, statutes, reports, and precedents, a library inside the legislative building was part of the machinery of self-government. The Capitol therefore held several kinds of national life together. It held space for speech. It held space for judgment. It held space for study. It held papers, books, furnishings, and symbols. It held the accumulated routines by which a new government tried to make itself durable. That is why the burning of the Capitol would become both architectural destruction and institutional shock. A destroyed room can be repaired. A roof can be rebuilt. Stone can be recut, glass replaced, metal refitted, walls cleaned, and chambers restored. But the act of burning the Capitol carried a meaning that exceeded reconstruction. It suggested that the visible seat of the Republic could be reached, entered, and damaged by an enemy force in a single night. The shock was also practical. When a chamber burns, the work done there is interrupted. When furniture, records, and papers burn, habits of government are broken. When a library burns, the knowledge stored for daily use disappears. Earlier that day, some federal records had escaped in carts, carried away from Washington and eventually toward Leesburg, Virginia. But not everything inside the Capitol could be removed before the British arrived. The building still held its chambers. It still held its books. It still held the material world of Congress and the court. The British decision to burn public buildings in Washington was part of a punitive strike against the government. It was not an attempt to occupy the Capitol permanently or destroy every private home. The targets mattered because they represented the federal state. The Capitol was the first and most concentrated of those targets. To set fire there was to make a statement against the government of the United States in the place where that government most visibly spoke. The building's construction also shaped what would happen when the flames were lit. The Capitol was unfinished, but it was not flimsy in every part. Benjamin Henry Latrobe's work had introduced fire-resistant materials into portions of the structure: sheet iron, marble, sandstone, zinc, copper, and masonry vaulting. Those choices would matter. They did not prevent devastation. They did not save the interiors from ruin. But they helped parts of the Capitol survive when the rooms themselves were attacked with fire. This tension between ruin and survival is important to hold in mind. The Capitol did not vanish entirely. It became a burned building, a damaged institution, a visible wound. Its materials resisted in places while its contents were consumed. The same structure could testify to destruction and endurance at the same time. Inside, however, the vulnerability was immediate. The rooms contained furniture that could be gathered. The principal spaces could be turned into furnaces. The architectural features meant to elevate public life could become casualties of heat. Glass skylights, carved stone, and sculpture were not abstractions. They were physical elements exposed to deliberate fire. What had been designed to frame Republican government would be forced to endure the violence of war indoors. The Capitol's unfinished state, then, was not a minor architectural note. It was part of the meaning of the night. The British entered a capital whose central symbol was still incomplete, yet already burdened with the responsibilities of a nation. The building was young, but it housed institutions that claimed permanence. It was vulnerable, but it represented authority. It was partly built, but already irreplaceable in the imagination of the Republic. Standing before it, the soldiers were not only facing masonry and timber. They were facing the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress gathered within a single exposed complex. They were facing the public voice of the United States, in rooms where law, judgment, and memory had been given physical form. The first fires would make that meaning visible. In the South Wing, the Hall of the House of Representatives waited with its furniture, its skylights, its stonework, and its symbols. Soon, those elements would be piled into the violence of the night, and the Capitol's architecture would become the fuel, the witness, and the survivor of an institutional blow. In the South Wing, the violence of the night became interior. The Capitol had already been chosen as a public target. Its shape on the hill, unfinished and exposed, made it the most visible emblem of the government the British force had come to punish. But the burning did not happen only from the outside, as if flame were simply applied to a wall. It moved through rooms. It found furniture, papers, woodwork, cloth, and symbolic objects. It turned the working chamber of the House of Representatives into a furnace. The Hall of the House of Representatives, known today as National Statuary Hall, had been designed to give the legislative branch a physical grandeur. In 1814, it was still part of a young building, but it was already a room of ceremony and argument, a place where the public business of the House had been given an architectural setting. Members had spoken there, voted there, and performed the daily work of representative government beneath glass skylights and among carved stone. When British soldiers entered that space on the night of August 24, 1814, the chamber's furnishings became the material of destruction. They gathered furniture into a large pile in the hall of the House of Representatives. Then they coated it with a paste made with gunpowder. The method mattered. This was not an accidental spread of flame from one burning structure to another. It was deliberate preparation. The furniture was turned into fuel, and the accelerant made the chamber itself a planned center of heat. The fire rose inside a room built for law. It is easy, looking back, to imagine the burning of Washington only in broad outline, a capital city, a defeated defense, public buildings set alight. But the smaller mechanics of the attack bring the night closer. Chairs and desks had to be handled. Combustible contents had to be found and gathered. The fire was built from the ordinary objects of government, from the tools of debate and administration. What had served the daily rhythm of Congress was repurposed into a weapon against the building that housed it. As the flames intensified, the heat climbed upward toward the glass skylights above the chamber. The skylights had been one of the room's architectural features, bringing light into the hall during the day. That night, they became part of the evidence of how hot the fire grew. The glass melted. The image is precise and unsettling. Not merely broken panes, not only smoke blackening a ceiling, but glass softened by heat until it lost its form. The chamber became hot enough to transform the materials around it. Fire moved from furniture to air, from air to architecture. It reached the visible surfaces that had made the room stately and bright, and it altered them permanently. The stone suffered too. Carved stone was among the Capitol's proud materials. It gave the building weight and dignity. It connected the new federal seat to older ideas of civic architecture, to republics and empires that had expressed authority through columns, chambers, and sculptural forms. Yet in the South Wing, the fire's heat severely damaged carved stonework. Stone can seem permanent compared with timber or paper, but under violent heat it can crack, spall, discolor, and lose the sharpness of its carved detail. In the House chamber, the fire attacked not only what was flammable, but what was meant to endure. Among the damaged works was Giuseppe Franzoni's life-size marble statue of Liberty, placed above the speaker's rostrum. That detail gives the destruction a symbolic force that is difficult to miss, even when described calmly. Above the place where the speaker presided, above the institutional center of the House chamber, stood a figure of Liberty, carved in marble. In a room dedicated to representation, the image was not incidental decoration. It gave visual form to the political language the Republic used about itself. Liberty looked down over the chamber in which elected representatives conducted public business. The fire rose toward that symbol. Franzoni's statue was severely damaged in the burning. The marble figure, life-size and elevated above the rostrum, became part of the ruin. This was not the death of an idea, but it was the visible injury of an emblem. The United States had built a capitol to display its institutions. The British attack damaged those displays in the very rooms where they were meant to speak most clearly. And still, the Capitol did not simply vanish. One reason parts of the building survived was the work of Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Latrobe had helped shape the Capitol's architecture before the attack, and his choices became unexpectedly important during the fire. He used fire-resistant materials in parts of the building: sheet iron, marble, sandstone, zinc, copper, and masonry vaulting. Those materials could not prevent destruction everywhere. They did not save the hall of the House of Representatives from severe damage. They did not spare the chamber's furnishings, its skylights, or its carved stone from the effect of heat. But they helped prevent total loss. This is one of the contradictions at the heart of the Capitol's burning. The building was deeply wounded, yet not annihilated. Its unfinished state made it vulnerable. Its construction also contained forms of resistance. Masonry vaulting and non-combustible materials slowed the work of fire. They compartmentalized destruction in ways timber could not. Latrobe's fire-resistant design choices helped portions of the Capitol survive the attack, leaving behind not a clean absence, but a ruin that could be read, repaired, and eventually rebuilt. The Capitol after the fire was therefore neither untouched nor erased. It was something more complicated, a damaged public building whose survival showed the limits of the flames and the foresight embedded in its construction. The same walls that had held the government's chambers now held smoke, heat scars, broken surfaces, and the memory of an assault. That survival mattered politically as well as architecturally. If the Capitol had been entirely consumed, the image would have been one of total collapse. Instead, the ruins testified to injury and endurance at the same time. Fire had entered the House chamber and damaged the material symbols of the Republic, but the structure was not reduced to nothing. The building remained as a problem for the nation to confront, not merely whether to mourn it, but whether to restore it, occupy it again, and continue the business it had been built to contain. Inside the South Wing, the British had made the House chamber burn by using its own contents against it. The room's furniture, coated with gunpowder paste, fed the flames. The skylights melted. The carved stone was severely damaged. Franzoni's Liberty, watching from above the speaker's rostrum, was struck by the heat of the fire. Around those losses, Latrobe's iron, stone, metal, and masonry helped hold parts of the Capitol against complete destruction. But the fire did not stop with architecture. The Capitol was more than chambers and stonework. It was also a storehouse of working knowledge. Under the same vulnerable roofline were books gathered for Congress, a collection meant to support legislation, inquiry, and national administration. As the flames moved through the building, the injury to the Capitol widened from the visible and ceremonial to the intellectual. What burned there was not only the setting of government, but part of its memory and mind. More than 3,000 volumes waited in the path of the night. The flames that struck the House chamber were visible in stone, glass, and smoke. They left damage that could be pointed to: melted skylights, scarred carving, the wounded figure of Liberty above the speaker's rostrum, and rooms blackened by a fire deliberately fed. But within the same Capitol, another loss was quieter and harder to see once it was gone. It had weight before the fire, shelf by shelf, volume by volume. Afterward, it became absence. The Library of Congress burned that night. In 1814, the library was not yet the vast national institution later generations would recognize. It was a working collection inside an unfinished Capitol, gathered for the practical use of Congress. Its books were part of the daily machinery of government. They helped legislators consult law, history, political theory, geography, diplomacy, and the accumulated arguments of earlier ages. The collection stood near the center of public decision-making, not as an ornament, but as a tool. That fact gives the loss its deeper meaning. The British attack on the Capitol destroyed walls, chambers, furniture, and symbolic spaces. But when the library's more than 3,000 books burned, the injury passed beyond architecture. It reached into the intellectual equipment of the Republic. Congress lost not only a room with shelves, it lost a body of reference, memory, and inquiry that had been assembled to help the government think. The Capitol itself had gathered institutions under one vulnerable roofline. The House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress all occupied the same unfinished complex. Earlier in the night, that concentration had made the building a powerful target. To strike it was to strike the visible seat of the national government. But the concentration also meant that when fire moved through the Capitol, it could damage several forms of authority at once. Lawmaking, judgment, ceremony, and knowledge were all exposed. The library's destruction belongs to that wider pattern. It was part of the burning of the Capitol, but it was not merely incidental. Books were combustible in the simplest physical sense. Paper, bindings, shelves, and furniture could feed a fire that had already been encouraged with deliberate methods elsewhere in the building. Yet the meaning of the burning was not limited to fuel. A library is a record of what a government believes it may need to know. In Congress, it marked the expectation that public power should be informed by texts, precedents, and comparisons. Its destruction made the Capitol's loss intellectual as well as physical. More than 3,000 volumes vanished in the attack. Written as a number, the loss can seem contained, as if it were a line in an inventory. But each volume represented selection, purchase, transport, placement, and use. Each stood as part of a collection still young, but already tied to the work of a young federal government. The library had been built in a city that was itself still forming, housed in a capital that was not yet complete, serving a Congress that had placed its records, debates, and ambitions in rooms vulnerable to war. The fire made that vulnerability undeniable. Throughout August 24, 1814, the government had already been forced to confront the fragility of its paper foundations. State Department clerks had packed essential records, including the Charters of Freedom, into coarse linen bags and carts, sending them away from Washington toward Leesburg, Virginia. House and Senate papers had also been moved by congressional clerks, though many records of Congress and archives of the Navy, War, and Treasury departments would still be lost in the fires. The evacuation of documents showed that public memory could not be assumed safe merely because it belonged to the United States. It had to be carried, hidden, locked away, and protected by hurried human action. The Library of Congress could not be saved in that manner. The books remained inside the Capitol when the British entered the city and set about burning public buildings. Unlike the most essential state papers, the collection was not evacuated to a cellar vault miles away. It was too large, too embedded in the building, and perhaps too easily mistaken for something less urgent than charters, treaties, and official records. But in the aftermath, its importance became plain. A legislature without its library had lost one of its instruments of continuity. The contrast is striking. Some records survived because clerks acted before the flames arrived. The library did not. One part of the government's memory was carried through the countryside in bags and carts. Another part remained on shelves until heat and smoke consumed it. Together, those two facts reveal the nature of the night. Preservation and destruction unfolded at the same time, separated by chance, judgment, mobility, and the speed of an enemy advance. The books also remind us that the Capitol was not only a stage for national symbolism, it was a workplace. The House chamber had its furniture and rostrum. The Senate had its rooms. The Supreme Court occupied space within the same structure, and the library served the ongoing business of public life. In a young republic where institutions were still establishing their habits and authority, such a collection mattered because it connected current debates to wider bodies of knowledge. It helped Congress reach beyond the immediacy of petitions, votes, and emergencies. When those books burned, the loss could not be repaired by sweeping ash from the floor or replacing a table. Walls could be rebuilt. Stone could be recut. Chambers could be reopened. But a working collection required judgment and time. It had to be chosen again. It had to be assembled again. It had to regain breadth and usefulness. The fire had interrupted not just the place where Congress met, but the resources Congress used to inform itself. This is why the burning of the library belongs at the emotional center of the Capitol's destruction. The night in Washington is often remembered through its most dramatic images: flames rising from public buildings, British troops moving through the Capitol, the president's house abandoned, a dinner table found inside before fire was set. Those images endure because they make invasion visible. But the library's destruction asks for a quieter kind of attention. It asks us to imagine loss, not as spectacle, but as removal. Shelves once full, then empty. A collection once usable, then unrecoverable. The mind of an institution suddenly diminished. And yet, even in that loss, the story bends toward renewal. The library did not remain only a ruin in memory. After the burning of the Capitol and the destruction of the Congressional Library, Thomas Jefferson offered his personal library to Congress. That offer would become one of the most consequential acts of rebuilding after the attack. In 1815, Congress purchased Jefferson's library, receiving 6,487 volumes, with Jefferson paid $23,950. What had been destroyed in Washington would be replaced not by a simple duplicate, but by a larger and deeply shaped private collection, gathered over a lifetime of reading. That later act does not soften the violence of the night. It does not return the more than 3,000 books that burned inside the Capitol, but it shows how the Republic answered an intellectual wound with an intellectual reconstruction. The fire had revealed that knowledge itself could be a casualty of war. Jefferson's offer would acknowledge that Congress needed more than rooms in which to meet. It needed a library worthy of the work placed before it. For now, on the night of August 24th, the library was ash within the damaged Capitol. The British had struck the building that held the legislative chambers, the court, and the collection that served them. The attack had turned the Capitol into ruin and symbol at once, partly destroyed, partly spared by materials that resisted flame, and deeply marked by what could not resist at all. From that height, the night's destruction did not end. The Capitol had been the first great public target, but it was not the last. After the fires were set there, the British force moved down Pennsylvania Avenue toward another seat of national meaning. Ahead stood the president's house, evacuated in haste, carrying the traces of domestic life interrupted by war. Inside, officers would find a table set for dinner before the mansion, too, was given to flame. From the Capitol, the fire could be read across the city. It marked the hill where Congress, the Supreme Court, and the library had stood within unfinished walls, and it announced that the British attack was not finished. The force that had entered Washington around 8 o'clock on the night of August 24, 1814, now turned from one national symbol toward another. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, away from the burning Capitol, the road led toward the president's house. That movement mattered because it joined two centers of meaning in a single line of destruction. The Capitol represented law, debate, judgment, and the collected knowledge of government. The president's house represented executive authority, but also something more intimate. It was a public building, yet it was also a residence. It held offices and ceremonial rooms, but it also held meals, furniture, household rhythms, and the daily evidence of a family living within the machinery of the state. By the time British troops approached it, that domestic order had already been broken. Earlier that day, the American defeat at Bladensburg had made the evacuation of Washington urgent. President James Madison had been drawn into the uncertainty of the battlefield and the road beyond it. Dolley Madison had waited at the president's house as the danger came closer, delaying long enough to insist that Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington be removed before she fled. Paul Jennings, then a 15-year-old enslaved African-American in the White House, helped in the effort to save it. The exact details of that removal would later be told in differing accounts, but the central fact remained: before the British arrived, the painting of Washington was taken out of the house. That absence is important to imagine alongside what remained. The president's house was not empty in the way a ruin is empty. It was empty in the way a place is left when departure has been forced too quickly. The official household had gone. The president and first lady were no longer there. But the building still held the signs of preparation, service, and expectation. According to the accounts preserved in the history of the attack, British officers found a dinner table set. It is one of the most vivid contrasts of the night. At the Capitol, the British had encountered chambers of government, furniture to be heaped together, materials to be burned, and books that would become ash. At the President's house, they encountered a table prepared for a meal. The detail is simple, almost quiet. Plates, place settings, the order of a household expecting to receive or feed people. It is not dramatic in itself. That is why it carries such force. War enters most sharply when it interrupts something ordinary. A dinner table set in the executive mansion suggested that only a short distance separated routine from catastrophe. The city had not been built as a fortress. Washington was still young, exposed, and unfinished in many ways. Its public buildings stood with symbolic confidence, but their defenses had failed in a single afternoon. Now, within the president's residence, the gap between national ambition and physical vulnerability could be seen in domestic form. The British did not need to hold the house for the symbolism to work. Their raid was punitive, directed against public buildings of the United States government. The burning of Washington came in part as retaliation for American destruction in Upper Canada, including the burning of York, now Toronto, on April 27, 1813. The targets in Washington were chosen for what they represented: the Capitol, the President's house, the departments of government, and the materials that made war and administration possible. The President's house was therefore both home and target. Inside, the method followed the logic already visible at the Capitol. British troops did not simply stand outside and wait for the building to catch. They set fire to combustible contents within the mansion. The house's interior became the medium of its destruction. Furniture, fabrics, papers, and other burnable materials gave flame a way to move through rooms that had been designed for residence, reception, and authority. The same kind of deliberate action that had turned the House chamber into a furnace now entered the rooms of the executive mansion. There was a brutal intimacy in that act. A public building can seem abstract until one sees the objects inside it. A chair where someone sat, a table laid for dinner, a room arranged for use, not for history. When British officers found the dinner table set, they found evidence of people who had expected the day to continue differently. They found the remains of an ordinary schedule overtaken by military defeat. The table did not defend the building. It did not alter the outcome. But it fixed the scene in memory because it made the invasion visible at human scale. The President's house had been designed to embody the office of the President within the new Capitol. It was part of the city's plan, part of the federal presence on the Potomac, part of the architecture through which the Republic tried to give itself permanence. But on that night, permanence depended on stone, distance, time, and luck, and none of them were enough to protect the mansion from a determined raiding force. Once the combustible contents were ignited, the house became another light in the burning Capitol. The flames there did not erase everything forever. The building would be rebuilt. James Hoban, the original architect of the President's house, would supervise its reconstruction after the fire. The work would take about 3 years before the mansion became habitable again, and President James Monroe would move into the reopened house in 1817. Later generations would know it as the White House, though the name did not come from painting over damage from the burning. The building had already been treated with a lime-based whitewash in 1798 to protect its aqueous stone. Even so, the fire of 1814 left material memory behind. According to the White House Historical Association, scorch marks from the burning remain visible in 2 unpainted exterior stone areas. Those marks matter because they resist the smoothing effect of reconstruction. They show that the house did not merely stand as an idea of continuity. It survived injury, repair, and return. But on the night itself, no such lawn view was available. There was only the shock of a capital invaded, the Capitol already burning, and the President's residence now being consumed from within. The dinner table made the scene almost unbearable in its contrast. It suggested not grand strategy, but interruption, a meal not eaten, a household scattered, a government forced into flight. It showed how quickly the ceremonial center of the Republic could be turned into a battlefield after image. The British commanders, including Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn, had brought their force from the Patuxent River landing at Benedict through the fighting at Bladensburg and into Washington. By the time they reached the president's house, they had already demonstrated that the city could be entered, its principal public building fired, and its institutions struck in succession. The burning of the mansion deepened the humiliation. This was not simply damage to walls. It was a message carried through architecture, yet the destruction remained selective in its larger pattern. Most private property was spared, though at least one house near the Capitol was searched and burned after musket fire was reported from nearby buildings. That distinction does not soften the attack, but it helps explain its purpose. The British did not come to burn every street. They came to punish the United States government by burning the places where that government worked, met, stored knowledge, and displayed authority. The president's house stood at the center of that purpose. In the space of a few hours, Washington had become a map of exposed symbols. On Capitol Hill, the unfinished national legislature burned. Along the avenue, the executive mansion burned. The public meaning of the city was being attacked building by building, not as an accidental sweep of flame, but as a deliberate sequence. The dinner table remained the unforgettable detail because it made that sequence personal. It placed the violence of empire and republic inside a room prepared for evening routine. And still, the night had more targets. Beyond the president's house stood the other working organs of the federal government, the departments where war, diplomacy, finance, and records gave daily form to national power. There were also ships, ammunition, and stores at the Washington Navy Yard, materials that could aid an enemy if captured. As the fires spread through the visible symbols of the Capitol, another logic was taking shape as well, the burning of offices by the invader and the destruction of American naval property by Americans themselves, so that what could not be defended would at least be denied. The attack on the president's house gave the night one of its most enduring images: a public mansion entered after flight, a dinner table still set, and the domestic center of the republic turned into a target of war. But the British movement through Washington did not stop at symbols that could be easily pictured. The raid also reached the more practical anatomy of government, the offices where paper, correspondence, accounts, commissions, and military direction made the United States function from day to day. These were not merely buildings with names on them. The Treasury, the War Department, and the State Department held the working instruments of a young federal government. Their rooms connected policy to administration. They held records of decisions made and money spent, of soldiers organized and supplies purchased, of diplomacy conducted and obligations recorded. To burn them was to strike at something less visible than a dome, a chamber, or a presidential dining room, but no less important. It was an attack on the government's memory and machinery. In the Washington attack, the Treasury building was burned. So were the War Department and the State Department buildings. Their destruction widened the meaning of the raid. The Capitol had carried Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress under one unfinished roof. The president's house carried the visible presence of executive authority. The departments carried the labor behind authority, the papers, ledgers, orders, and archives that turned the idea of government into daily action. The loss of those offices mattered because the United States in 1814 was still young enough that its institutional memory was fragile. Much of its public life existed in documents that could be bundled, shelved, copied, misplaced, rescued, or burned. The earlier evacuation of certain State Department records had shown how clearly some officials understood that danger. John Graham, Stephen Pleasanton, Josias King, and others had packed important records, including the Charters of Freedom, into coarse linen bags and carts before the British entered the city. On August 24th, those evacuated records were carried to Leesburg, Virginia, about 35 miles northwest of Washington, and locked in a cellar vault of an abandoned house. That rescue did not mean the federal record was safe. It meant only that some of the most precious documents had escaped the immediate line of fire. Elsewhere, congressional clerks saved some House and Senate papers. House papers were moved to a secret rural location, 9 miles outside Washington. Senate papers were moved toward Prince George's County and Brookville, Maryland. These acts of removal were improvised, urgent, and incomplete. They belonged to the same day as the defeat at Bladensburg and the evacuation of the Capitol, when decisions had to be made under the pressure of rumor, smoke, and approaching troops. What remained behind was exposed. Many records of Congress were lost. So were archives of the Navy, War, and Treasury departments. The loss was not dramatic in the way a collapsing roof or a burning portico was dramatic. Paper often disappears without leaving a monument to itself. Yet for a government, paper was evidence. It was continuity. It was the trail by which people could know what had been ordered, promised, paid, debated, and decided. When those records burned, the damage reached backward into memory and forward into administration. The War Department's loss carried a particular edge. The city had fallen after a military failure outside it, at Bladensburg, and now the department responsible for war stood in the path of destruction. Its archives represented not battlefield glory, but the less visible structure of military power: correspondence, returns, supply records, and the administrative weight behind armies and defenses. Burning such a department did not simply punish a building. It struck a system already revealed as vulnerable. The Treasury, too, represented more than money. Finance was the bloodstream of the federal government. It connected taxation, debt, purchasing, salaries, construction, war expenses, and national credit. In a republic fighting a war, the Treasury's records were part of the state's ability to know itself. Their destruction added a bureaucratic wound to the visible humiliation of the capital's capture. The State Department had another kind of importance. It was the keeper of diplomacy and of some of the nation's foundational records. The successful removal of the charters of freedom has often stood out because of what it prevented. But the burning of the department building still reminds us that rescue was partial. The survival of one class of documents can sometimes conceal the scale of what was lost around it. In Washington that night, preservation and destruction happened side by side. There was also another fire in the city, one with a different author and a different purpose. At the Washington Navy Yard, the flames were not set by the British. They were set by Americans under orders to prevent ships and naval supplies from falling into enemy hands. The logic was hard, but familiar in war. If a position could not be defended, its useful materials could still be denied. Ships, ammunition, and stores at the Navy Yard were not symbolic in the same way as the Capitol or the President's house. They were usable. In British hands, they could become instruments of further military advantage. To abandon them intact would mean leaving value to the invader. To burn them meant destroying American property in order to keep it from becoming British property. This was the logic of denial. The Washington Navy Yard had already been connected to the wider crisis of the campaign. Commodore Joshua Barney's flotillamen had fought at Bladensburg, with United States Marines and militiamen making a notable stand before they were outflanked and Barney was wounded. Now, after the collapse of the defense and the entry of British troops into Washington, the Navy Yard's stores and supplies became a problem that could not be solved by evacuation alone. Under orders, American forces set fire to public stores and supplies. The act was destructive, but it was not the same kind of destruction as the British burning of the public buildings. It was not retaliation. It was not spectacle. It was military refusal. That distinction matters. The same night held two kinds of fire. One was imposed by the enemy against the public architecture of the United States government. The other was chosen by Americans against their own naval property because control had been lost and capture had to be prevented. Together, the fires revealed the condition of Washington after Bladensburg. The capital was not simply occupied. It was being stripped of usefulness, meaning, and continuity, sometimes by the attacker, sometimes by its own defenders. In the departments, the British fires attacked the offices where national power was organized. At the Navy Yard, American fire consumed things that might have strengthened the enemy. In both places, the flames were purposeful. They were not random extensions of the Capitol fire or accidents of wind. They followed decisions made by men who understood that buildings, ships, papers, ammunition, and stores all had military and political value. By late August 24th and into the following day, Washington had become a map of losses. On Capitol Hill, rooms that had held Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress were blackened and broken. Along Pennsylvania Avenue, the President's house had been entered, searched, and burned. Elsewhere, the Treasury, War Department, and State Department buildings had gone into the same destructive pattern. At the Navy Yard, American hands had put the torch to public stores rather than surrender them. The effect was cumulative. A capital does not depend on one building alone. It depends on the network between buildings. The legislature, the executive mansion, the departments, the records, the military stores, the roads, the clerks, the officers, the papers moving from desk to desk. The British raid exposed that network by burning through it. The destruction showed how much of a nation's authority rested not only in laws and offices, but in the physical vulnerability of rooms full of paper and supplies. And yet the night also showed that destruction was uneven. Some documents had been saved because clerks acted before the enemy arrived. Some congressional papers survived because they were moved out of reach. Some parts of the Capitol survived because earlier choices of material and construction resisted fire better than wood alone. Even in a city of flames, survival depended on timing, material, chance, and human decision. That unevenness is part of why the burning of Washington remains more than a simple story of ruin. It was a night of deliberate attack, hurried rescue, administrative loss, and denial by fire. The British destroyed public buildings to punish and humiliate the United States government. Americans destroyed naval property to keep it from strengthening the force that had entered their capital. In between those acts lay the paper record of a republic, partly carried away in carts, partly hidden in rural places, and partly lost forever. By the time the worst of the burning had done its work, Washington was no longer the same city the British had entered around 8 o'clock the night before. Its public buildings stood damaged or gutted. Its departments had been struck. Its navy yard had been sacrificed. Its records had been divided between survival and ash. Then, over the burned capital, the weather began to change. The fires had been made by human decision, but the next force to move through Washington would not belong to either army. On August 25, 1814, the sky itself would break over the city, bringing wind, rain, and violent force to streets already marked by smoke. By morning, the fires had already changed Washington. Smoke hung where public buildings had stood. Walls that had carried the business of government were blackened or open to the sky. The work of destruction had been deliberate, ordered, and human. It had moved from the Capitol to the President's house, from the departments to the Navy Yard, following the logic of punishment, denial, and war. Then, on August 25, 1814, the city was struck by a force that had no command structure, no political purpose, and no allegiance. A severe thunderstorm broke over Washington. The timing gave the storm a strange place in the memory of the burning. It came after the most visible damage had been done, after the British had entered the Capitol around 8 o'clock the night before, after the fires had been set in the public buildings, after the Navy Yard had been put to flame by Americans who would not leave ships, ammunition, and stores to the enemy. The storm did not save Washington from the attack. It arrived too late for that, but it did change the final shape of the destruction. The city that received it was exposed in ways that went beyond military defeat. Roofs had burned. Interiors had been gutted. Streets had been emptied by flight, confusion, and fear. The public core of the Capitol had been turned into a landscape of embers. In those conditions, a violent storm was not merely weather. It became another event in the same crisis. Accounts of the storm describe wind and rain powerful enough to knock down trees and buildings. Some later descriptions suggest that tornadoes may have been part of the violence that swept through the city. The wording matters. The evidence allows caution, severe thunderstorm, possibly including tornadoes. But even without certainty about the exact form of the wind, the effect was plain. Washington, already damaged by fire, was struck again by the sky. In a city of unfinished federal architecture, scattered private houses, open spaces, and damaged public structures, fallen trees, and collapsed buildings carried a particular weight. The Capitol had been young before the British came. It had already held the symbols of national power before it had gained the layered defenses and physical density of an older seat of government. The storm revealed that vulnerability in another register. What fire had weakened, wind could break. What heat had left standing, rain could batter. What had seemed like ruin by design could be followed, almost immediately, by ruin without intention. And yet the storm also helped put out the last of the fires. This is one of the quiet contradictions of August 25th. The same weather that tore through Washington and brought down trees and buildings also helped extinguish embers left by the burning. Rain fell on charred masonry, on smoking timbers, on the remains of furniture and government offices. It fell where the Capitol had burned, where the president's house had been set alight, where the departments had been struck and where the Navy Yard had sent its own columns of smoke into the air. It did not restore anything. It did not undo the loss of the Library of Congress collection, the destruction of department archives, or the shock of seeing the Capitol occupied. But it checked the lingering fire. The city had been put in danger by flame spreading through vulnerable interiors and combustible contents. In the Capitol, British soldiers had used furniture and gunpowder paste to make the fire take hold inside principal rooms. At the president's house, combustible contents had been gathered and set alight. In the departments, the attack had struck the places where daily government lived in paper, ledgers, correspondence, and files. At the Navy Yard, American hands had burned public stores to deny them to the British. Across all of this, the storm came as a brutal interruption. It ended some danger while creating another. For those who had fled, hidden records, carried valuables, watched from a distance, or waited outside the city, the storm must have deepened the unreality of the moment. In less than a day, Washington had seen a battlefield defeat outside its approach, the entrance of enemy troops, the burning of national buildings, and now a violent convulsion of weather. The capital had not only been captured, it had been battered. The British force, meanwhile, did not intend to hold Washington. That fact is central to understanding the raid. The burning of the public buildings was not the beginning of a long occupation. It was a punitive and symbolic strike, tied to the wider war and to British retaliation for American destruction in Upper Canada, including the burning of York, now Toronto, on April 27, 1813. The aim was not to govern from Washington, or to defend it against an American counterattack, or to make it a British capital. The aim was to damage the visible organs of the United States government and then withdraw. By the evening of August 25, 1814, British forces began moving back toward Benedict, Maryland, the landing place on the Patuxent River from which the campaign had opened. The route of withdrawal carried them away from the burned capital and back through the same geography that had made the attack possible: Maryland roads, the approaches near Bladensburg, and the line back toward the Patuxent. The movement toward Benedict closed the loop of the raid. The British had landed there before advancing inland. From Benedict, Major General Robert Ross and the naval leaders connected to the campaign, including Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Sir Alexander Cochrane, had helped bring the threat from the river system toward Washington. The march had passed through uncertainty, American misjudgment, and fragile defenses. It had reached Bladensburg, where the American line failed after about 3 hours of battle. Then it had entered Washington after dark. Now, after the fires and the storm, the force began to reverse direction. On the way, the British stopped at Bladensburg to collect wounded soldiers. That stop carries the story back to the place where the road to Washington had opened. Bladensburg was no longer only the name of an American defeat. It was a battlefield with bodies, wounds, and unfinished obligations. The British victory there had made the night in Washington possible, but victory did not erase the cost of the fighting. Wounded men had to be gathered. The army that had struck the capital still had to account for those left behind by its own advance. The image is spare. Troops withdrawing from a burned capital, moving through storm-marked country, stopping at the battlefield where the previous day's combat had cleared their path. The public buildings of Washington were behind them. Benedict and the Patuxent were ahead. Between those points lay the evidence that this had been a raid, fast and destructive, but also physically limited by distance, weather, fatigue, and the need to return to the ships. For Washington, the departure did not immediately bring recovery. It brought a different kind of silence. The enemy was leaving, but the ruins remained. The Capitol's damaged chambers, the burned president's house, the wrecked departmental offices, the lost records, and the ruined naval stores all testified to the same lesson: the Capitol could be reached, entered, and struck. The storm had washed down embers, but it could not wash away what had happened. Still, the rain marked a boundary. The night of burning had passed into the day after. The British withdrawal had begun. The immediate violence was receding from the city, even as its consequences were only beginning to be understood. People would return to damaged buildings and missing papers. Officials would measure not only walls and roofs, but institutions wounded by fire. The nation would have to decide what could be rebuilt, what could be replaced, and what could only be remembered. In that sense, the storm over the burned capital did more than extinguish embers. It drew the line between destruction and aftermath. On one side stood the events of August 24th and 25th, Bladensburg, the entry into Washington, the fires, the storm, and the British withdrawal toward Benedict. On the other stood the long work that comes after humiliation, gathering what survived, replacing what was lost, and making damaged symbols usable again. The rain fell on ruins, but the ruins did not end the story. They became the ground on which the Republic would begin the work of reclaiming its books, its buildings, and its visible seat of government. When the rain passed and the British column was gone, Washington was left with the quieter labor of survival. The drama of the raid had lasted only a short time. The march from Bladensburg, the entry around 8 o'clock, the fires in public buildings, the storm on August 25th, and the withdrawal toward Benedict. But the aftermath belonged to a different clock. It would be measured in inventories, contracts, salvaged papers, temporary rooms, debates in Congress, and the slow return of government into spaces that had been made nearly unusable. The city had not been erased. That was part of the meaning of the British raid. It had been struck at its public center, at the buildings that gave visible form to national power. The Capitol, still unfinished in 1814, had burned in its principal rooms. The President's house had been gutted. The Treasury, War Department, and State Department buildings had been burned. At the Washington Navy Yard, American hands had set fire to ships, ammunition, and stores to keep them from the enemy. The damage was not only stone, timber, glass, and paper. It was symbolic. It asked whether a young republic could keep its authority intact after its capital had been entered and fired by a foreign force. The answer did not come in a speech or in a single act of defiance. It came through reconstruction. One of the first losses to be answered was intellectual. In the Capitol, the Library of Congress had burned with more than 3,000 books. The destruction of that collection was more than the loss of volumes on shelves. It was the burning of a working library used by lawmakers, a tool of legislation and inquiry inside the national legislature. Congress had lost not only a room and its furniture, but part of the knowledge structure that supported its work. Into that absence stepped Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had spent decades building a personal library that ranged far beyond a narrow legal or political collection. After the destruction of the Congressional Library, he offered that library to Congress. The offer mattered because it treated the loss not as a minor inconvenience, but as an institutional wound. A legislature needed books. It needed history, law, science, philosophy, geography, and the many categories of knowledge through which public questions could be argued and understood. Replacing the library was, in this sense, part of replacing the capacity of Congress itself. In 1815, Congress purchased Jefferson's library. Library of Congress records state that 6,487 volumes were received, and Jefferson was paid $23,950. Those numbers carry a quiet force. More than 3,000 books had burned. More than 6,000 volumes came in to rebuild and expand the collection. A room of ashes became the beginning of a larger national library. The replacement did not undo the fire. It did not restore the exact books lost in the Capitol, but it turned destruction into enlargement and memory into institution. The buildings themselves required a similar act of recovery. At the President's house, the work of rebuilding returned to James Hoban, the architect associated with the original design. The mansion had been entered by British officers after the Madisons fled, its rooms found with a dinner table set, its combustible contents gathered and fired. Afterward, its exterior walls remained, but the house needed extensive restoration before it could again serve as the home and office of the President. Hoban supervised that rebuilding. Timber framing was used inside to speed the post-fire reconstruction, a practical choice made under the pressure of restoring the executive mansion to use. The work took time. The President's house was not made habitable again in weeks or months. It took about 3 years before the mansion could be occupied once more. In 1817, President James Monroe moved into the reopened White House. That return carried more weight than a change of residence. It marked the reoccupation of a symbol that had been violated in wartime and then deliberately reclaimed. The building had been burned as a public emblem. Its reopening made it an emblem again, but now with the memory of fire built into its story. Even the stone remembered. According to the White House Historical Association, scorch marks from 1814 remain visible in two unpainted exterior stone areas. They are not the whole story of the building, but they are a rare physical trace of the night when war crossed the threshold of the executive mansion. They also help correct a common misconception. The house's white appearance did not begin as a cover for burn damage. It had already been painted with lime-based whitewash in 1798 to protect its aqueous stone. The fire added memory, not the name. At the Capitol, the work belonged again to Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who returned as architect of the Capitol. Before the attack, Latrobe's choices of materials had helped portions of the structure survive. Sheet iron, marble, sandstone, zinc, copper, and masonry vaulting had resisted what wood alone could not. After the fire, the building was both ruin and survivor. Its north and south wings had been damaged. Its rooms had been attacked with flame. Glass skylights had melted. Carved stone had been severely injured. Yet parts endured because of the very architectural decisions meant to defend against fire. Latrobe's return therefore joined design to repair. The Capitol had housed the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress. To rebuild it was to restore more than a meeting place. It was to make room again for the branches and functions of the federal government that had been crowded into an unfinished Capitol and then exposed by war. In 1814, the unfinished Capitol had shown the vulnerability of national ambition. In Reconstruction, it became a test of whether that ambition could continue after humiliation. The records presented a different problem. Some had survived because clerks had acted before the British arrived. State Department clerks, including John Graham, Stephen Pleasanton, and Josias King, had packed important records, including the Charters of Freedom, into coarse linen bags and carts. On August 24, 1814, those evacuated records were taken to Leesburg, Virginia, about 35 miles northwest of Washington, and locked in a cellar vault of an abandoned house. Congressional clerks also saved some House and Senate papers. Those acts mattered because the Republic was not only its buildings, it was also its written memory, laws, correspondence, treaties, accounts, orders, and records of public action. But not everything could be saved. Many records of Congress and archives of the Navy, War, and Treasury departments were lost in the fires. Here, the aftermath could not fully repair the damage. A burned wall could be rebuilt. A roof could be framed again. A library could be replenished, even transformed. But a destroyed archive left gaps. The government could resume its work, but some of the paper trail of that work had vanished. The country would rebuild around absence as well as survival. This is why the aftermath of the burning of Washington cannot be understood as a simple return to normal. The city did return to use. Congress continued. The executive mansion was reopened. The Capitol was repaired. A new foundation was laid for the Library of Congress through Jefferson's books. But the event changed the meaning of those structures. After August 24th and 25th, 1814, the Capitol and the President's House were not merely young public buildings in a planned capital. They were places that had been tested by invasion, fire, weather, and abandonment, and then brought back into national life. The night Washington burned revealed how fragile the Republic's physical seat truly was. Roads from the Patuxent could bring an enemy inland. A defeat at Bladensburg could open the way to the Capitol in a single afternoon. Public buildings could be entered, searched, piled with combustibles, and set alight. A library could vanish. Departments could lose records. The President's house itself could become a shell. But the aftermath revealed something else with equal clarity. The Republic's symbols were fragile, but they were not disposable. Its records could be rushed into carts and hidden in a cellar vault. Its portrait of Washington could be cut from danger and carried away. Its burned library could be answered by Jefferson's 6,487 volumes. Its executive mansion could be rebuilt under James Hoban and inhabited again by James Monroe. Its Capitol could draw Benjamin Henry Latrobe back to the work of repair. The fires of Washington were meant to punish and to humble. They succeeded in leaving scars. Yet those scars became part of the nation's memory, not the end of its institutions. In the ashes were missing books, broken rooms, and blackened stone. But there was also a decision, repeated in many hands in many places, that the visible seat of government would not be abandoned to ruin. The night showed how easily buildings could burn. The years after showed how fiercely a republic could reclaim what those buildings stood for.